Good morning, friends. Let me start another section of anti-epilepsy. In the first part of epilepsy, we saw the introduction and also the related causes and the symptoms which may be arised due to the epilepsy. And today we'll see about the mechanism of action, how it has been happened, and what are the type of drugs can be used so that the epilepsy can be taken over. And now yesterday we were discussing about this epilepsy is due to more of inhibition or more of excitation. We know that the inhibition is done by the GABAergic neurons. This I have indicated over here. And also we know that the glutamate is excitation is done by the glutamatergic neurons, that I have indicated over here. So we are doing what it is doing both on the activities, whether it is inhibition or whether it is excitation. Now as I indicated over here, this is all just the synapse, the post synapse, that means before the post synapse it is pre-synapse, and here this is the post synapse and this is a pre-synapse, and these pre-synapse, this of pre-synapse of glutamatergic neurons have indicated the post synapse over here, indicating over here. That means the transmissions whatever the glutamatergic neurons has been submitting are submitting onto the post synapse, and later the GABAergic neurons, the transmitters which are being used are being released and it is being submitted onto the post synapse. From the glutamatergic neurons the excitation is coming over, from the GABAergic neurons the inhibition is coming over. We know that the GABAergic neurons will be submitting their inhibitions with the help of chlorine ions, the flow of chlorine ions. And this was always done by the fate of GABA in our previous videos, where we saw the release, the synthesis and metabolism of GABA there. And so that's just a little part of that can be captured over here. And here the glutamatergic ions, or we know that the glutamatergic is one of the excitations which is done by the action potential and by the hyperpolarization. In order to do the hyperpolarization activity, we want two types of ions over there. Why? Because they are voltage gated. We know that voltage gated sodium ions will be available and voltage gated potassium ions will be available. And also we know that the GABAergic neurons are also been helping with the help of GABA receptors, which may help with GABA A with inotropic receptors, and GABA B is working with metabotropic receptors. Here we are talking about the inotropic receptors, where it is submitted by all the 5 subunit units and it is having some flow of chlorine ions. So we are submitting. Now we'll see what happens in the presynaptic area. We know that this is a neuron, these are the axons, and the last part will be a synapse part, and the synapse part here we done with two types of neurotransmitters. I've done it here. Two types of ionic transmissions. One is sodium, which is called as sodium channels, that I'm indicating over here. Voltage gated sodium channels. Voltage gated. And ODG is submitting sodium ions into the presynapse, where the hyperpolarization will start their activity and it has to be continued until it reaches your repolarization. And later you have done it in another model over here. These are called as calcium channel ions. Here I am writing over here calcium channel ion, which is voltage gated. You have submitted the word here. So if you see the synapse, which consists of glutamate with the presynaptic vesicles over here, you can see the 2 presynapses, synaptic vesicles, which are filled with glutamate. And these are always available in the storage place in the presynaptic area with some sort of type of synapses over there. We know that the synaptic vesicles are always the storage of that particular neurotransmitter. If it is a glutamatergic neurons, the storage is glutamate. If it is a GABAergic neurons, it is storing GABA. If it is something acetylcholine, it is storing acetylcholine there. So different types of neurons which are submitting their neuron transmitters have their synaptic vesicles over here. So you can see the synaptic vesicles here. Once the sodium and potassium is being input over there, and once the sodium is being flow in more and more, we need the potassium, we need the place where the plus ions are all accumulated over here. And this plus ions will make an initiation of hyperpolarization or depolarization. This depolarization activity has to be more and more deepened so that it reaches the threshold potential and action potential starts at this place. In order to reach from depolarization to the hyperpolarization stage, it needs some more ions to get inside. So that work is done by calcium over here. I've submitted over calcium ions. So where we know that it is more and more submitting of plus ions over here. So what happens when more and more potassium, more and more calcium and more sodium has been submitted inside the presynaptic area, what happens? It starts depolarization, reaches to the hyperpolarization, and the synaptic vesicles will come and touch the end part of the glutamagic synapse, and this synapse will get bursted itself, leaving all the synaptic vesicles storage place of GABA, whatever the glutamatic neurotransmitters outside. And here I've indicated over here which are being eliminated out after the depolarization and repolarization activity. Once the neurotransmitter is been submitted out, what happens? The flow of potassium will start over here. All the potassium ions will be submitted out. Whenever the potassium has been submitted out, we know that the plus ions are being eliminated. So it reaches the stage of repolarization and the work is completed in the presynapse. So the neurotransmitter which has been submitted in the junctional place, it has to reach the postsynaptical area, and this postsynaptic area should consist of some receptors. Always the glutamagic receptors consist of two types of receptors on top. So what they are called as AMPA. This is one of the receptor onto the glutamagic receptor of postsynapse. And you have one more called as NMDA receptors, which are always having the floating of this neurotransmitter which has been submitted onto the junction and being released outside, released out and enter into the postsynaptic area. So the junction which is having the neurotransmitter is being submitted to with the help of two receptors. One is called AMPA receptor and the other one is called NMDA receptor. That we already know that, we do not discuss about that. And so now the neurotransmitter is ready into the postsynaptic area. So what happens? The postsynaptic area will start the depolarization activity so that it is submitted to the other receptor which is consists of the presynaptic area. Why? Because it is a transmission between two neurons. So but in epilepsy what happens is this potassium, the calcium and potassium which has been submitting more and more will be higher in amount. So what happens? The potassium channels will increase, the calcium channels will increase. So what happens? All the plus ions will be more and more and more and more, and the synapse is always filled with the positive ions. So what happens? There will be some lightening and there will be some spark, there will be some firing into the neurons, and it cannot be like more and more excited and may not be controlled back. Why? Because there is a potassium and there is no flow of potassium outside, and it is only submitting all the sodiums and into the plus ions into the presynaptical area. So what happens? It starts firing, and that firing, what happens? After firing, it cannot able to accumulate itself inside it and starts discharging into the synaptic vesicles. That means synaptic junction, what we saw here. And what happens? That type of lightening and that type of firing will be submitted to all the neurons. So once happens, the epilepsy will start existing over the here. Why? Because there is more and more excitation. We know that if at all there is excitation and inhibition in the control balance, the working of the limbs and working of the biceps and triceps muscles will be in a perfect condition. But if at all the excitation is more and more and may not be reached back with the inhibition, so what happens? The firing happens, the lightening happens. So one type of the neurons will always discharge their ions outside, and the postsynapse will collect the same what is happening in the presynapse, and it will submit the same message to the other neurons. So what happens at that time? We get seizures, nothing but the episodic neuronal discharge, or it may reach to the convulsions, nothing but the jerking of the body, which is reaching to the different types of seizures, different types of epileptic forms, what we can call it as atonic, tonic, tonic clonic, myoclonic. So different types of seizures, depends upon the intensity of it. So one thing what we need to remember at that spot is, yesterday we saw that if at all the sodium and calcium will be submitted onto the one part without any progression or without any spreading to the other lobes, they stay same, but will have some partial seizures. Once the calcium reaches the cortical area and the cortical area will submit their own ions to all the lobes, then we can have the generalized seizures. We know that yesterday we were discussing about that with the simplex, complex partial seizures and different types of generalized seizures. So now this the submission of excitation has been over. Now we'll see what is the chapter of GABAergic inhibitions. As I told you before, always the excitation should be balanced by the inhibition. So what happens here? The inhibition is done by the GABAergic neurons. Here the submission of the presynapse consists of different types of qualities, where it is been storage, where it is having some synaptic vesicles, where it is having some metabolism. So I have indicated here the synaptic vesicles, which have been indicated in red and which consists of all the black ions. So all the black points are emitting your GABAergic neurons. So the remaining process is the same. It has to be depolarized, the submission of sodium, the submission of potassium, and also the synapses we should come over here. It should have some ruptures over here. It has to submit on to the postsynapse with the GABAergic neurons. So what happens here? The GABAergic neurons has to submit it on GABA receptors. We know that it always has to be submitted on GABA. Here we saw two types of receptors, AMPA and NMDA receptors, but here we have to see about GABA receptors. We know that it is always submitted by a rosette type of petal-like structures, which consists of 5 petal-like structures and has to travel 4 membrane layers of cell membrane, which consists of 2 alpha, 2 beta and 1 gamma, and in the center you have a pore which is always submitting the chlorine ions. So you can see the pathway. Once the neuron transmitter is been touching your postsynapse onto the GABA receptors, the way of between the chlorine has been entered over here, and it is submitting all the minus ions. So once the minus ions are being submitted there, the inhibition activity starts off. Why? Because there is no positivity, and also if you see that if at all the person is not in epilepsy condition, this plus ions will be submitted, this minus ions, and there is a balance of the postsynapse and the message is being forwarded. But here we need to see the concept that the patient is having epilepsy. So that means there is higher amount of sodium, higher amount of calcium is already submitted, but here the chlorine may not be controlled by this. Why? Because their quantity is more and their quantity is less. So what happens? They not be having balance between sodium and chlorine. What happens? The inhibition may not be controlled, and sometimes the inhibition may not be happen with this, and this inhibition is less the required quantity. That means the Cl minus is less. But sometimes what happens, the inhibition may be more. That means the flow of Cl minus is more rather than the flow of potassium and calcium. So at that time we get freezing part, nothing but the absence seizures, where we can see the freezing of the epileptic persons. So this type of condition may also be seen, but in general we can see the two types of qualities. What is that? The submission of higher sodium and the submission of higher calcium, and this has to be balanced with the Cl minus ions. But if at all the balance is not able to maintain, that is not been having done, and the firing may be enhanced and submitted to the postsynaptic. The various messages can be transferred. And here one more point can be added. If at all we need to get more and more Cl minus ions into the presynapse, So what happens? We know that the GABA A is being reuptaken for the storage of the synaptic vesicles by a process called metabolism here. So sometimes there is reuptake. I've already indicated over here. Here it's a word called reuptake. I'm writing over here what it is called, reuptake. So what it is indicating that some of the GABA may not be submitted onto the prejunctionals and it has to submit it back to the GABA receptors, enters into the GABA floaters, and where it is being metabolized by GABA T, nothing but the transaminase, into SSA, what is called as semi-succinic acid. We know that the semi-succinic acid and is always converted to alpha ketoglutarate acid, and this alpha ketoglutarate acid is directly submitted into the Krebs cycle. So what happens is, whenever we want to whenever we want to make more and more minus ions in order to balance with your potassium and sodium, so what happens? The chlorine flow should be more and more. So once the chlorine flow has to be more and more, the metabolism has to be, that reuptake has to be blocked off. So this is a just general mechanism how the epilepsy can be taken back. But here we can see that with the different types of drugs we can stop epilepsy. And by seeing the picture, as I told you, once the habit of what is the aim of epilepsy is to make your sodium and calcium ions lesser submission. So what happens? We have sodium channel blockers into the classification. Sodium channel blockers. Why? Because once these are blockers, once these are the ionic channels are blocked over here, we can see that the sodium cannot be submitted inside. And also you can see that there is a blockage of calcium over here. So we can see calcium channel blockers. The next best category can be calcium channel blockers. So that means the drugs what we are using was trying to block your calcium channels. And later you can see that we can stop NMDA, nothing but the receptors of the glutamate. So what we can write, NMDA antagonist. Yesterday in Parkinsonism also we saw this type of antagonist. So that is called NMDA antagonist. That means it cannot enter the neurotransmitter for the translational messages. So that can be the next category. What is that category? NMDA antagonist. And also you can see here the flow of Cl minus has to be increased. In order to increase the Cl minus ions, we can use barbiturates and benzodiazepines. That also can be included over here. Barbiturates and benzodiazepine. So this may be the next category. And also the next category is, as I told you, the reuptake has to be blocked off. That means the metabolism has to be blocked off. So that also can be added, that the GABA metabolism inhibitors. This is done by gabapentin. That is a much more better potent drug, GABA metabolism inhibitors. So these are the different types of drugs which can be used for the mechanism of action in order to rectify your epilepsy. And this is mechanism of action, and in the next class we'll do what is the different types of drugs and what are the types of classifications, and we'll finish off the chapter along with that. Bye for today.